They said there would be a lot of guests at the house for Christmas, that it would be more comfortable for me downstairs, so I wouldn't get in the way. The basement was cold, with a cement floor and an old couch, but I didn't argue. I just listened. And then I quietly listed the property on Airbnb, so when they came back from their shopping trip, their key no longer fit the lock. I didn't raise my voice. I simply rented out the estate at market price. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Martha Elgin. I was 72 years old that December, and I had lived in the same brick colonial-style house in Greensboro, North Carolina, for over 4 decades. I wasn't born in that house, but it was the only one that had ever truly been mine. My late husband, Walter, and I bought it in 1981. We paid off the mortgage with patience and discipline. He worked as a high school principal, and I was a senior accountant for a local construction firm. We weren't flashy people, but we kept good records, paid our taxes on time, and built something solid from the inside out. After Walter passed, the house changed, but only in texture. His chair by the fireplace stayed empty, but I dusted it regularly. His tools in the garage remained in perfect order. I never stopped maintaining the place, even if the work became heavier with the years. The garden still bloomed in spring. The gutters still got cleaned in fall. The pantry stayed stocked, even if fewer hands reached into it. It wasn't until my son Charles lost his job during the market downturn that he asked if he and his wife Tessa and their 2 boys could move in for a little while. He sounded sheepish on the phone, and I didn't hesitate. Of course I said yes. That's what mothers do. I cleared out the guest rooms. I stored my sewing machine. I made the space welcoming. At first, it worked. Tessa thanked me profusely and brought home fresh flowers. Charles promised to help with bills until he got back on his feet. The boys ran through the halls like Justin once had, their laughter echoing against the walls like memories. I cooked full breakfasts. I set extra places. I didn't mind the noise. But time wore that arrangement thin. A few months stretched into over a year. Then another. Charles got a job again, a decent one, but they stayed. At first, he said they were saving for their own place. Then Tessa started talking about renovating parts of the house to make it more functional. That's when I started hearing strange phrases: open layout, modern touches, repurpose the formal dining room. They didn't ask. They just started talking as if the decisions were already made. There were changes, small ones at first. The blue plates I kept for holidays disappeared from the kitchen cabinets, replaced by a white minimalist set. A storage bench appeared in the entryway. My lace curtains were replaced with neutral blackout panels. The front door was repainted without a word. I came home from a grocery run to find the living room rearranged and my late husband's reading lamp in the garage for donation. They called me Mom or Gran, but my name wasn't written on any of the changes they made. I wasn't asked about paint colors or furniture swaps. Tessa once laughed and said the house was finally starting to feel like ours. I kept quiet. I told myself it was just growing pains. I reminded myself they were family, and family made sacrifices. I had been raised in a generation that didn't complain loudly, that made room, that stayed useful even when the room had been taken over. But by the end of the second year, my role in the house had shifted. I was no longer the host. I was the woman who kept the place up, who folded laundry that wasn't hers, who knew where every screwdriver was, but was never asked to pick one up. I was the one who bought groceries, but whose favorite foods were slowly replaced with items I didn't recognize. Tessa began ordering from those trendy grocery services: almond milk, oat flour, something called vegan buffalo chickpea sliders. The boys stopped knocking before coming into my room. Charles started calling the upstairs office his workspace, even though I had set it up decades ago for tax season. Tessa began referring to the dining room as our entertaining area, and one night I overheard her on the phone calling the house their home base for the holidays. I was sitting in the den that night with the TV on low and a mug of peppermint tea cooling in my hands. Her words sank in like a stone in water. Their home base. I didn't say anything then. I just took another sip of my tea and stared at the twinkling lights they had strung across the banister. I had always loved decorating for Christmas, but that year I hadn't even been asked where the boxes were stored. They bought their own decor, silver and white, minimal and cold. The red velvet stockings Walter and I used every year stayed in the attic, unopened. It was a strange kind of grief, watching your home become a set piece in someone else's play. I had always believed that kindness would earn reciprocity, that being generous would keep you close. But what I learned, slowly and quietly, was that comfort makes people forget where they started. And when they forget, they redraw the map without you. I had kept the records, the deeds, the bank statements, every paper with my name on it. I hadn't needed to look at them in years. But that winter, I found myself pulling them from the filing cabinet again, not out of anger, but because I needed to remember the shape of what I had built. I wasn't just the woman in the back room folding towels. I was the one who had built the frame, poured the foundation, made the payments, signed the papers. I was the household veteran, and I was not ready to be erased. It was the second week of December when Tessa came into the kitchen with her usual clipboard and her too sweet smile. She had already started decorating: silver wreaths, battery-powered candles, velvet bows on the staircase, everything coordinated, nothing sentimental. I had learned to stand aside during the holidays. My traditions had been pushed to the attic along with the cardboard boxes marked Mom's Xmas. That morning, she didn't offer coffee. She stood near the sink flipping pages, then casually mentioned that they would have a full house this Christmas. Her voice was upbeat, rehearsed. She explained how her sister was coming with her husband and their 2 kids. Her cousin, recently divorced, was flying in from Florida. A couple of friends were making a road trip from Asheville. There were just so many moving parts, she said, and so much to coordinate. I listened without interrupting. I already knew where it was going. I'd heard this tone before. It was the same one she used when she told me she was reorganizing the pantry and that my spice rack had been retired, or when she rearranged the living room and said my recliner had been moved to make more space for guests. Then she said it lightly, like a passing suggestion. It would be so much easier if you stayed downstairs for a few days. Not, would you mind? Not, could we talk about this? But a soft directive wrapped in a smile. She went on about how the basement would be quieter, how I'd have my own space, how she would move a sectional sofa down there and set up a little corner for me. Microwave, mini fridge, even a table lamp. She made it sound like an upgrade, a retreat, as if I hadn't spent 40 years living upstairs as the owner of the house. I nodded slowly. I said I'd think about it. But of course, the decision had already been made. That afternoon, Charles carried the old L-shaped sectional down from the den and wedged it into the corner of the basement between the laundry sink and the circuit breaker box. A thin throw blanket was folded on one end. Tessa brought down a plastic bin with snacks: low-sodium crackers, herbal tea bags, some dried fruit in a Ziploc. She placed a ceramic mug on top, the one that said, "Bless this mess," in gold cursive. A little joke, I suppose. They set up a small space heater next to the couch. The extension cord trailed from the outlet near the boiler, which hissed and clanked every 20 minutes like it was coughing up the past. The air down there was always damp, no matter how many times we tried to seal the walls or run a dehumidifier. I could smell the memory of old cardboard, wet concrete, and forgotten laundry. They plugged in a lamp on the folding card table. Tessa adjusted the shade, turned it slightly toward the sofa, then stepped back with satisfaction. She said she would bring me some holiday-scented candles to make it feel festive. I said thank you. I didn't say anything else. When they left me alone in the basement, I sat down on the sectional and stared at the wall. The only decoration was an old framed poster from one of Justin's middle school science fairs. It had curled at the corners. I pulled the blanket over my lap and listened to the sound of footsteps above me. Laughter, cabinet doors opening, the scrape of chairs against hardwood. It wasn't the cold that hurt the most. It was the language, the subtle, smiling exile, the ease with which they relegated me to a storage space so they could entertain properly. I wasn't angry. I was aware of how easily people redraw the boundaries of belonging when it suits their needs. That night, I lay on the sectional and stared at the ceiling joists. Pipes ran along them like veins, wrapped in yellowing insulation. I could hear water rushing through them when someone upstairs flushed a toilet. My legs ached from the stairs. My back felt twisted from the angle of the cushions. But I didn't complain. I didn't call out. I didn't text my son to say it was too cold or too loud or too lonely. Instead, I reached for the tote bag I had brought down with me. Inside, I had my tablet. It was old, but it still worked. I opened the browser and typed in the site I hadn't visited in years, Airbnb. Walter and I used to book little trips through it, bed and breakfasts in the mountains, a cabin in Tennessee one spring. We always laughed at how the hosts left us handwritten notes and homemade granola. We used to talk about renting out our place someday, maybe when we traveled more. We never did. Now, I scrolled through listings. I looked at properties nearby, then similar homes in the region. I searched holiday rentals and whole house availability. My eyes moved slowly, but my mind was moving faster. The idea didn't arrive fully formed. It grew, quietly, methodically. I closed the tablet and laid it on the table beside me. Upstairs, I heard Tessa's voice. She was laughing. She said something about how everything was finally coming together. I looked around the basement, at the exposed wires, the single overhead bulb, the water heater humming like a warning. And I smiled, not with bitterness, with clarity. By the time morning light filtered through the narrow basement window, I had already been awake for hours. The sectional had done nothing good for my back, and the humming of the water heater didn't leave much room for restful sleep. But none of that bothered me as much as it should have. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Alertness, not nerves, not anxiety, just focus, like my mind had finally moved from the waiting room back into the center of the house. I went upstairs before anyone else woke. The kitchen was dark but familiar. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved around by memory. I poured water into the kettle, feeling the weight of it, the rhythm of the old faucet's squeak. I made myself tea and stood near the window, watching the street outside grow lighter, the trees bare and reaching toward the pale sky. When the sun finally pushed past the rooftops, I went back down to the basement, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and opened my tablet again. This time, I didn't just browse. I registered. Creating an Airbnb listing isn't difficult, but it does require attention, details, intent. I had spent my life surrounded by spreadsheets and receipts, organizing other people's chaos into columns. This was no different. I selected entire home under listing type, scrolled through location settings, added Greensboro, North Carolina, then moved on to the description. I wrote slowly, carefully, like I was composing a letter to someone I wanted to impress without revealing too much. Charming family home in a quiet residential neighborhood. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, spacious living room with fireplace, fully stocked kitchen, and holiday decor throughout. Ideal for couples, families, or travelers looking for a cozy seasonal getaway. I paused, then added, 5 minutes from downtown, parking available. Hosts speak English and Southern. It made me smile. I knew I would need photos. I didn't have many on the tablet, but I remembered that Charles had taken pictures for the neighborhood group last year, some sort of home tour fundraiser. I opened the shared cloud drive on the family computer, and there they were, dozens of clean, flattering photos. Living room with a crackling fire in the background. Dining table set for 8. Even one of the guest rooms with holiday pillows and warm lighting. I downloaded all of them. He'd taken them with his fancy camera, probably for vanity. Now they would serve a different purpose. I uploaded 12 shots, added captions, and moved to pricing. I set the rate a bit above the local average. It was Christmas after all. Supply was short, demand was high. Then came availability. I selected December 22nd through December 27th, 5 nights, just enough to cover the holidays. I paused at the section that asked, "Will you be present during the stay?" The options were yes, no, and only for check-in. I selected no. The irony of it wasn't lost on me. The woman asked to disappear would now be invisible by design. I completed the tax information, connected my bank account, reviewed the terms and conditions, and hit publish. It was done. My listing went live within the hour. By the time Tessa came down to the basement to ask if I wanted anything from the store, I had already received one inquiry from a couple in Charlotte. They wanted to spend Christmas away from the city. They asked if the fireplace was real, if the neighborhood was quiet, if there would be holiday lights. I told them yes to all 3. Tessa smiled vaguely and told me they'd be gone most of the day doing errands. I nodded. She didn't ask how I'd be spending my time. She never did. Once they left, I made my way upstairs. I moved slowly through the house, seeing it the way a guest might. The framed photos, the antique sideboard, the throw blanket on the couch that had once belonged to my sister. Everything was warm, inviting. The scent of pine from the artificial garland still lingered in the living room. I took notes as I went. Extra linens in the hall closet, towels in the basket near the dryer, baking sheets in the lower kitchen cabinet. I made a checklist on the back of an old electric bill and taped it to the fridge. Later, I pulled out the spare set of keys and checked the batteries in the keypad lock on the front door. Everything worked perfectly. I knew it would. I'd been the one maintaining this house for 40 years. In the afternoon, I printed a guest welcome sheet and folded it in thirds like a letter. I wrote out the Wi-Fi password, emergency contact numbers, directions to the grocery store, and a list of nearby restaurants. I included a handwritten note at the bottom. "We hope you enjoy your stay in our family home. May your holidays be warm and peaceful. M." I placed it on the entryway table. By dinner time, the Charlotte couple confirmed their booking. Payment processed. Lockbox code sent. Arrival instructions emailed. I sat at the dining room table and stared at the confirmation screen for a long while. There was no rush of victory, no thrill, just a calm, weighty sense of having taken back something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Control. I wasn't angry. I wasn't planning revenge. I simply no longer accepted being erased. For the first time in a long while, I was on the list, not as an afterthought, not as someone to be moved out of the way, but as the host, the owner, the one who welcomed and decided. I went back to the basement that evening, poured myself another cup of tea, and sat with my shawl pulled tight. The boiler hissed behind me, and above my head footsteps moved lazily between rooms. They had no idea what I had done, and I had no reason to tell them. The morning they left for their big day of errands, the house finally exhaled. I heard the front door click shut, the car door slam, the engine pull away from the curb. Then, stillness. Not the kind that feels lonely, but the kind that feels like an empty canvas. I climbed the stairs from the basement and paused in the hallway, listening just to make sure no one had forgotten something, and doubled back. No creaks, No voices, no keys in the lock. I had the house to myself. The first thing I did was disable their access. Years ago, Charles had installed a smart lock on the front door for convenience. He synced it to his phone, of course, and added access codes for himself, Tessa, and the boys. I remember watching him do it, saying nothing when he explained that it would be easier to manage who comes and goes. He never offered to show me how it worked, but I'm not as helpless as they like to believe. Last year, I quietly had the app installed on my own phone, synced it to the same system using the administrator code. My code, the one I created when the house was first registered with the smart system. Charles had either forgotten or never thought to change it. It had sat unused, untouched, but still active, just like me. Now I opened the app and scrolled to user access. One by one, I revoked their codes. I deleted Charles's, then Tessa's, then the temporary one they had made for deliveries. I replaced them with a new set of digital keys linked to the guests who would be arriving in less than 24 hours. I reprogrammed the lock, updated the instructions in the welcome email, and saved everything to a file on my tablet. It was efficient, clean, unemotional. They wouldn't know until they tried to get back in. Next, I moved through the house methodically. I stripped the beds, replacing the linens with the good set, the ones I kept sealed in a tote under my own bed for someday guests. I ironed pillowcases, fluffed cushions, opened the windows to let the rooms breathe. The kitchen was next. I cleared the clutter, Tessa's mismatched mugs, Charles's protein powder canister, the boys' sticky cereal boxes, and stowed them in a bin under the stairs. In their place, I arranged matching dishes, clean glassware, and fresh dish towels. I placed a holiday-themed runner across the island, added a bowl of clementines and cinnamon sticks, and lit one of the new candles I'd bought online the week before. It smelled like baked apples and pine, like a memory that was never quite yours, but still comforting. By mid-afternoon, the house had transformed. Their chaos had been replaced by my order. I moved with steady purpose. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't even being sneaky. I was reclaiming a space that had always been mine, restoring it room by room with hands that still remembered how to care for something properly. Upstairs, I cleaned the bathrooms. I refilled the soap dispensers, set out folded towels, and placed small baskets with travel-sized shampoo, conditioner, and lotion. I had read that guests appreciated touches like that. It was about hospitality, intention. In the boys' room, I removed the toys and plastic bins of crumpled clothes, vacuumed the rug, and turned the bunk beds into a guest-friendly twin and trundle setup. I added extra pillows, left a book on the nightstand. Downstairs in the living room, I recentered the coffee table, replaced the piles of unopened mail and half-empty chargers with a stack of magazines, a vase of fresh greens, and a coaster set I had once been given as a retirement gift but never used. The fireplace was clean and ready. I placed a bundle of kindling in the basket beside it. I knew people loved that touch. Outside, I took down the gaudy inflatable snowman they'd staked into the lawn and replaced it with a simple wreath on the front door. I swept the steps, cleared the last of the leaves from the walkway, and when it was all done, I stood in the center of the living room and looked around. It was beautiful, not just tidy or presentable, beautiful. It felt like the home Walter and I had dreamed of when we first walked through it in the early 80s. A house filled with warmth, welcome, dignity, not entitlement, not imposition. I looked at the clock. The guests were arriving the next afternoon. There was still one thing left to do. I opened the hall closet and took out the family's spare set of keys, the metal ones. I placed them in a small envelope, sealed it, and wrote "Return to owner" on the front. Then I tucked it into the mailbox. I didn't want to keep them. I didn't need to. They wouldn't work anymore anyway. That evening, I made myself a pot of soup, I ate at the kitchen island with the lights dimmed and soft music playing in the background. Something classical, something that filled the space without demanding anything from it. For dessert, I baked a tray of oatmeal cookies and divided them into cellophane bags tied with ribbon, one for each guest, a note attached to each one. Happy holidays, wishing you warmth and rest. M. By the time I returned to the basement, I felt something loosen in my chest. I wasn't angry, I wasn't bitter, but I was finished asking for permission in my own home. They had their errands, I had my house, and tomorrow it would welcome new people, people who would knock, be let in, and say thank you. That would be enough. The first guests arrived just after noon on the 22nd. I had been watching the street from the upstairs window, nursing a mug of hot cider and waiting for the unfamiliar license plates to turn onto our block. When the dark SUV pulled up, I knew immediately it was them, the couple from Charlotte with the toddler. He carried the child on his hip while she navigated their bags from the trunk. They looked travel-tired but hopeful, the way people always look when they've left something behind and are stepping into the unknown with the fragile belief that things will be better, even for a few days. I met them at the door with a practiced calm. I had on my nicest cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons, and my hair pinned back just so. I welcomed them in and handed them the keys with a quiet smile, then gave a short tour, the living room, the kitchen, the bedrooms, the little notes I had left for them on the counters and nightstands. The wife's shoulders relaxed when she saw the cookie basket. The child immediately ran to the sofa and curled into the throw pillows like they'd been waiting for her all year. They said it smelled like Christmas. They didn't ask if I was staying. I didn't offer. I told them to call or message if they needed anything. Then I slipped out the back door and down the stairs into the basement. My space, temporary, functional, and exactly what I needed it to be. By 4 o'clock, the second set of guests arrived, a young couple from Atlanta on a winter road trip. They brought wine and their own coffee beans and left their shoes by the front door without being asked. They were the kind of people who appreciated quiet corners and soft lighting. The woman took pictures of the fireplace and the Christmas table runner. The man asked if the record player worked. It did. I'd tested it that morning. By evening, the house felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Not noisy, not chaotic, just full. I heard laughter drift through the vents, not shrill or demanding, but warm and muffled by the walls, softened by the distance. I sat in my makeshift living space on the basement sofa with a notebook on my lap and let the sounds settle into me like music. Upstairs, someone opened a bottle of wine. A cork popped. Music played, something jazzy. I recognized the rhythm. The guests chatted. Footsteps moved between rooms. Water ran. Drawers opened and closed. The kitchen came to life. I imagined hands reaching for utensils, spices, measuring cups. I had left everything clean, labeled, and ready. My house had always been a good kitchen. It just hadn't been appreciated for a long time. Later, I ventured upstairs under the guise of checking the trash bins and passing through with a basket of extra towels. I was greeted with smiles and nods. The toddler waved. Someone offered me a slice of apple tart they had bought at a local bakery. I declined, but thanked them. One of the guests complimented the light in the dining room. She said it felt like something out of a magazine. I felt a flicker of pride and tucked it away without letting it show too much on my face. That night, when I returned to the basement, I lit a candle and wrote in my journal for the first time in months. I didn't write about my son or Tessa. I didn't list grievances or outline revenge. I wrote about the way the house felt with people who noticed things. The way one guest had gently folded the blanket on the sofa when he was done with it. How another had sent me a message saying, "Thank you for sharing your home. It's lovely." Not once did they refer to me as a burden. Not once did they ask me to move or shrink or adjust. I was the host, not in theory, but in practice. That night, I slept better than I had since before the tree went up. The basement was still cold, the sofa still firm, but there was something different in the air. The silence wasn't heavy. It was earned, chosen. The next morning, the smell of coffee brewing upstairs reached me through the vents. I waited quietly, then climbed the stairs and stepped into the kitchen to find a mug already set out for me. A small gesture, but it stopped me. The woman from Atlanta looked up from her seat at the island and smiled like I belonged there. I poured my coffee, sat down, said nothing, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was exactly where I should be. They returned around 7 in the evening, arms full of shopping bags and voices still buzzing from the day's errands. I was in the kitchen when I heard the tires crunch onto the driveway. I didn't rush. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned casually against the counter. The lights inside the house were warm. Soft jazz played through the living room speaker. One of the children was laughing in the hallway, and somewhere upstairs, someone was running a bath. The front door stayed closed. I heard the key try the lock once, then again, and then a pause. Another try, a knock. The first one was tentative. The second was harder. Then came the sound of bags dropping, followed by the voice I knew too well. Charles, sharp with confusion, louder now, calling my name through the door like he didn't understand why it wouldn't open. I stepped forward slowly, not to answer the door, but to close the living room pocket door behind me so the guests wouldn't be disturbed. The young couple from Atlanta were curled on the couch, a blanket shared between them, watching an old Christmas movie. They glanced at the door when the knocking came again, but said nothing. I smiled and whispered that I'd take care of it. Then I walked to the foyer, calm and deliberate. My slippers made no sound on the floorboards. I reached the door and opened it just a crack, enough to see my son's bewildered face and Tessa behind him, holding a bag of tissue-papered boxes, her expression already twisting. He started to speak. I raised my hand gently, the same way I used to when I needed a classroom full of teenagers to stop talking and listen. They quieted. I stepped outside, pulled the door shut behind me, and looked them in the eyes. I asked if they had checked their email. Of course they hadn't. They were confused, offended. Charles asked what was going on. Why wasn't the key working? Why was their code invalid? Where were their things? I told them simply, the house was occupied by guests, rented legally and fairly for the holidays. Charles looked stunned, as if I had spoken another language. He blinked, still trying to catch up. Tessa's expression hardened. Her voice rose. She said something about disrespect, about betrayal, about, how could you? I didn't answer those parts. Instead, I told them I had resecured the property for the duration of the rental and that their belongings had been packed with care and placed in the garage, which remained unlocked for now. I offered them a list of nearby accommodations, even included a motel they had stayed at once years ago when their air conditioner broke. I handed Charles a printed copy of the rental confirmation. The ink was still fresh. I told him the guests were kind, respectful, and paying above market price. He read the paper in silence. Tessa asked if I was serious. I told her I was. She said it was Christmas. I nodded. She said families didn't treat each other like this, and I agreed. Then I turned and walked back inside. I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back. I closed it quietly, firmly, and locked it. The click echoed through the foyer like punctuation. I returned to the living room just as the movie reached its final scene. The couple on the couch had shifted to make room for the child from the other family, who had wandered in with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. They looked up at me and smiled. I nodded and sat in the armchair nearest the fire. No one asked about the noise outside. No one asked if I was all right. They trusted that I was. Upstairs, The bath stopped running. In the kitchen, a kettle began to whistle. I stood and walked back to the stove, filled a mug with hot water, and dropped in a bag of chamomile. My hands were steady. My heart was quiet. Outside, the car didn't move for a long time. I didn't watch it. I knew they would drive away eventually, after the indignation gave way to logistics, after their pride melted just enough to think rationally. Later that night, I heard a soft knock at the back entrance. I opened it and found 2 boxes and a suitcase, neatly arranged near the steps. A note sat on top in Charles's handwriting. "Call me when you're ready to talk," it said. I folded the note, put it in my pocket, and carried the boxes inside. I didn't answer. Not that night, not the next. Inside my house, the rooms were warm and lit. Guests moved through them gently, with care. They spoke softly. They cleaned up after themselves. They thanked me for everything. They asked for nothing more than what was offered, and I gave it gladly, because this was my house, and for the first time in years, it felt like it again. Christmas morning arrived not with chaos, but with calm. I woke early, not to the sound of shouting children or slamming cabinet doors, but to soft footsteps upstairs and the low hum of conversation drifting through the vents. The house smelled like cinnamon and cloves, like something slow-baked and deliberate. I lay still for a moment in the basement, letting the silence settle over me, warm and complete. When I finally rose and climbed the stairs, the house was already alive, but in a different rhythm than in years past. There were no frantic last-minute wrappings, no arguments over batteries or missing ribbons, no television blaring commercials or video games. Just a slow, thoughtful pulse, the kind of morning that unfolds rather than explodes. In the kitchen, the couple from Charlotte was making pancakes. The toddler sat in one of the dining chairs with a mixing spoon, happily licking the remains of batter. The woman waved me in and offered me coffee, already knowing how I took it. 1 sugar, no cream. It was a small thing, but it felt enormous. I accepted the mug, took my seat at the kitchen island, and watched as they moved together easily. The husband flipped pancakes while humming under his breath. The wife reached up to retrieve plates I had stacked on the shelf just yesterday. No one asked me where anything was. No one needed me to fix or fill or mediate. I wasn't serving. I was simply there. Soon the couple from Atlanta joined us. They carried with them a basket of pastries they'd picked up the day before, wrapped in a cloth that smelled faintly of almond and vanilla. We passed around the food, and one by one the guests took their places around the dining table I had once sat at alone, year after year, outnumbered by people who treated me like background noise. Now the table was full, not of family by blood, but of people who had chosen to be here, who respected the space they occupied, who said please and thank you, and looked each other in the eye when they spoke. We didn't exchange gifts. There were no expectations, no awkward performances. One of the guests offered to share a short toast. She stood with a glass of orange juice and said she was grateful for warmth, for safety, for kind strangers who made room for others. We all raised our cups and glasses and nodded. I didn't cry, but something loosened in my chest. After breakfast, we cleaned up together. No one disappeared. No one barked instructions or left a mess behind. The man from Atlanta dried the dishes while his partner stacked them neatly in the cupboards. The toddler helped carry napkins to the trash with the solemn pride only small children have. Someone turned on music, soft instrumental carols, and the house filled with a sound that didn't overwhelm. Later, the Charlotte couple asked if they could light a fire in the fireplace. I showed them how the damper worked, how to stack the kindling. We sat together in the living room afterward, sipping tea and sharing stories. They told me about their wedding last year, their little apartment, the way they hoped to buy a home someday that felt as lived in and warm as mine. I didn't tell them about the years I had spent trying to preserve that warmth for people who never noticed. I didn't talk about Charles or Tessa or the cold concrete of the basement before I made it mine. I didn't need to. I belonged here now, not because I forced it, but because I had invited it. As the afternoon faded into evening, the light through the windows turned golden, then violet. I stepped outside onto the front porch for some air. The wind was sharp, but not biting. The street was quiet. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. A neighbor's wind chime rang softly. My breath came in clouds, steady and sure. I looked out at the lawn, cleared of inflatable decorations and tangled lights, now just a clean, sleeping stretch of grass. The wreath on the door swayed slightly. I remembered hanging it there alone, a small act of reclaiming. Now it looked like it had always belonged. Back inside, someone had turned on the tree lights, the glow reflected in the front window like a lantern. I stood there for a moment, hands in my pockets, just watching. When I re-entered the living room, they made room for me without hesitation. Someone handed me a blanket. Another offered to refill my tea. I didn't protest. I didn't feel the need to. That night, after the guests retired to their rooms and the house settled into sleep, I sat in the armchair by the fire and opened the notebook I kept tucked behind the bookshelf. I wrote a few simple sentences, nothing dramatic, just fragments of truth. I wrote, "This is the kind of Christmas I never knew I wanted. Quiet, whole, undemanding." I closed the notebook and placed it back on the shelf. Upstairs, I turned off the lights and checked the front door one last time. Locked, secure, mine. Before heading to bed, I paused in the hallway outside the guest rooms. I could hear the low sound of a lullaby from someone's speaker, the hum of a heater, the peaceful silence of a house at ease. It was still Christmas, but everything had changed. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for it to be over. I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be, at the heart of it all, at home. December 27th came with a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. Not silence in the way of absence, but quiet in the way of fullness. A slow, gentle hum underneath everything. The kind of quiet that followed a deep exhale. The kind of quiet you only noticed after the noise had left and your body remembered how to unclench. The guests had all departed by mid-morning. One by one, they carried their bags down the front steps, waved from their car windows, and drove away. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no exaggerated shows of gratitude, just sincere thank yous, folded blankets, and handwritten notes left on nightstands. One family had left a box of tea on the kitchen counter with a ribbon tied around it. Another had slipped a small envelope under the door of the basement with a note that simply read, "You gave us peace." I stood in the foyer after the last car pulled away, holding a broom in one hand, watching the street as the wind swept fallen pine, needles across the curb. The neighborhood was quiet again. Decorations on nearby houses were beginning to sag, wreaths slightly tilted, inflatables deflated from timers gone wrong. But the quiet inside the house felt earned, like something planted had finally taken root. I walked through each room, slowly. The linens needed to be washed, the guest towels folded. A couple of mugs sat by the sink waiting to be cleaned. But nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt like a burden. There was no one stomping through the halls or barking about errands. No one adjusting the thermostat behind my back or switching off lights while I was still in the room. No one hovering behind me with suggestions about how to make the place more functional. It was just me and the house. I started with the living room, plumping cushions, collecting stray napkins, setting remotes back where they belonged. The fireplace was cold now, but the memory of its warmth still clung to the stone. I vacuumed up a few pine needles from under the tree, then sat in my favorite chair and stared at the lights for a while. I didn't take the decorations down. Not yet. I had time. In the kitchen, I played the radio softly, instrumentals, nothing too sentimental, and wiped down the counters. I moved with a rhythm that felt like habit and meditation. My hands knew what to do without direction. I boiled water for tea. I steeped it slowly. I drank it standing by the window where I could see the bare trees sway in the wind. The kind of cold that made you grateful for warm socks and thick curtains. I thought briefly about Charles and Tessa, about where they might have spent their holiday, whether they had found another house to stay in, whether they had argued, blamed each other, sat in cold silence. I didn't feel spiteful. I didn't imagine revenge. I just wondered how long it might take for them to realize what they had allowed themselves to become, and how much they had underestimated me. In the afternoon, I took out the guest book I had left in the entryway, a simple journal with a red cloth cover and gold-edged pages. I had half expected it to remain blank, but each page was filled. Neat handwriting, messages of gratitude, observations about the home, compliments on the decorations, the softness of the towels, the smell of cinnamon in the air. They had noticed the little things. I sat on the floor by the heater and read every message twice. Later, I gathered the laundry and made my way to the basement. The space that had once been the only corner left to me now felt like a different place altogether. Not a storage space, not a punishment, a room I had used, adapted, survived. I sorted the sheets and pillowcases with care, added lavender detergent, and listened to the low rush of the water as the cycle began. While the machine hummed, I sat on the steps and rested my head against the wall. I didn't feel lonely. There's a quiet that comes after reclaiming something. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or applause. It shows up like the first morning of a long-awaited day off, when the world still sleeps and you remember your own name before anyone else says it. That's what this was. The house didn't feel empty. It felt paused, breathing, waiting. That night, I didn't sleep in the basement. I went upstairs to my old bedroom. I remade the bed with fresh linens and aired out the quilt that had been stored away since fall. The room still held traces of my scent: rosewood, talcum powder, chamomile. It was mine, untouched by anyone else's schedule or noise. I sat at the vanity, brushed my hair slowly, turned on the bedside lamp, and let the light settle around me like a shawl. In the hallway, all the doors stood open. The house didn't need to be closed off anymore. I fell asleep with the door wide, the air still, the silence between the days thick and kind. 2 days after the last guest left, an email from Charles arrived in my inbox. The subject line was short: "Let's talk." The body of the message was longer, though I could feel him straining to keep it measured, composed. He started with an apology, brief, understated, and a little late, but it was there. He wrote that they hadn't expected things to go the way they did, and that they had perhaps misunderstood the boundaries of living together. He asked if we could meet, in person. "Just you and me," he wrote. No mention of Tessa. I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. Then I wrote a simple reply: "Tomorrow at 10, here." At 9:55 the next morning, I made a pot of coffee and set out 2 mugs. I didn't bake anything. I didn't set the table or light candles or fold napkins the way I used to when I wanted to impress or soothe. This wasn't that kind of visit. He arrived exactly at 10. I watched him pull into the driveway from the kitchen window. He parked to the side like he knew better than to take the central spot. He didn't knock right away. He stood there for a moment, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched. The weather had turned colder again, the kind of brittle cold that made breath visible. When he did knock, it was quiet, almost unsure. I opened the door, stepped aside, and let him in without a word. We moved to the kitchen, sat at opposite ends of the small table, and for a minute neither of us spoke. I poured the coffee. He didn't touch it. He started with more apologies, softer this time, more human. He said they hadn't realized how far they'd pushed me, that the holiday chaos had distorted things, that they were overwhelmed and caught up, and maybe assumed too much. He admitted they should have asked, that they'd made themselves at home without understanding what that truly meant when it was someone else's house. I listened. Then I stood, walked to the drawer near the fridge, and pulled out a manila folder. Inside was a draft of the new agreement I had written days earlier, not in anger, but in clarity. It outlined everything: rent, space division, shared responsibilities, limitations. It designated the upper floor as mine, private and non-negotiable. It gave them access to the finished part of the lower level, the side entrance, the backyard, but not the kitchen, not the main bath, not the front porch. It included a clause about duration, renewable every 6 months, contingent on mutual respect. There was nothing emotional in it, just structure. I slid the folder across the table to him. He opened it and read silently, jaw tightening as he moved through each line. He didn't interrupt. When he reached the end, he asked if I was serious. I nodded once. He looked like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the angle. Not this time. He asked if Tessa could review it. I said of course, she could review it, mark it up, request changes. But the terms would not bend. This was no longer about accommodating family. It was about protecting peace. I told him I was done mothering grown adults who treated me like background noise. He didn't flinch. I think he already knew. He asked where they stood now. I said they could move back in under the terms in that document. Or not. The house wouldn't be empty either way. He stared down at the folder again, fingers tracing the edges of the paper. Then he pulled out a pen and signed. He didn't say much after that. He finished half his coffee. He asked if I needed anything from their storage unit. Some things, he said, they had moved out when they thought they were being polite. I told him I'd make a list. He nodded and stood. On the way to the door, he paused and turned to face me. He said, "Thank you, not thanks, Mom. Just thank you." I closed the door behind him and stood there for a while, hands still on the knob. The house was quiet again. The light through the front windows had shifted into something clear and sharp, winter light, clean and unforgiving. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up the folder, and slid it into the drawer where I now kept important things, alongside utility bills, service receipts, my living trust, documents of ownership, of decision. Later that afternoon, I sat in the sunroom with a fresh cup of tea and watched as the wind rattled the old maple branches in the backyard. The sound wasn't loud, but it reminded me of the first winter after Walter died, when the house had felt too big and too still, and every creak made me jump. But this time, the stillness felt earned. I didn't know if they would stay long. I didn't know if they would follow the agreement with grace or if new tensions would rise. But now, for the first time in years, the lines were clear. The contract was real, and I had a copy with my name at the top. Not as a mother, not as a guest, as the owner. The upstairs hallway felt different now. It wasn't just cleaner or quieter, it was mine again. I walked slowly past the guest rooms, the linen closet, the framed prints of mountain ranges that had hung in the same place since the mid-90s. Each step carried a weight I hadn't noticed before, the kind that settles into your bones after years of walking softly, making room for others, adjusting. At the far end of the hall was my bedroom, the front room. They had once called it the big room, as if it were an abstract space meant to be reassigned at will. Over the years, it had become a battleground for shifting ownership, a symbol of unspoken negotiations. First, it had been Charles's temporary office, then Tessa's yoga nook, Then the boys' makeshift playroom when the weather was bad. Always something that served someone else. But now, it was mine again. Fully, quietly, without needing to ask or announce, I opened the door and stepped inside. The winter sun had filled the room with pale gold light. The curtains, drawn halfway, moved gently in the draft from the old window panes. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the light touch my face as if the room itself was welcoming me back. The bed was freshly made with a patchwork quilt I had sewn years ago. The stitches weren't perfect, but they had held through time and weight and neglect. I had pulled it from the cedar chest the week before and aired it on the clothesline during one of the rare warm afternoons. It smelled of sunlight and something clean and honest. The bookshelf in the corner was in order again, not rearranged by little hands or filled with books I never chose. My novels, my cookbooks, the poetry I read before bed, even the old gardening almanacs I used to keep just in case I ever decided to plant dahlias again. On the nightstand was my lamp, the one with the heavy base and warm yellow glow. For years, it had been swapped out for something modern and efficient. Now it sat beside my clock, my reading glasses, and a ceramic dish that held nothing more than a pair of earrings and a safety pin. I crossed the room and opened the closet. Inside, everything was as it should be. No boxes that didn't belong to me, no seasonal storage, no forgotten toys or crates labeled with someone else's name. Just my clothes, my shoes, my old umbrella with the wooden handle. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window. From here, I could see the curve of the street and the neighbor's oak tree, stripped bare now, its branches clawing toward the sky like they were trying to hold it up. A small car passed by slowly. Someone walking their dog followed behind, bundled in layers, head bowed against the wind. The world hadn't changed, not really, but mine had. Downstairs, the house was still. I could hear the occasional creak from the settling floorboards, the gentle hum of the heater. No voices, no commands, no footsteps rushing past my door. For the first time in years, I didn't have to close the door to protect my peace. I left it open, and with the door open, I sat at my desk and opened a blank notepad. I made a list, not of chores or groceries, but of things I still wanted to do. A trip to the coast in April, if my knees held up. I'd been managing the stiffness better since I started those early morning walks. They weren't long, but they helped. I wrote down, walk every morning, even just to the corner and back. Then I wrote, call Dr. Beckett. I needed to schedule the follow-up scan. The pain in my side hadn't come back, but it lingered in my mind sometimes. More memory than sensation. I wasn't afraid, just ready to know. I had always faced things head-on, even when I wished I could turn away. Next on the list, repaint the pantry door. It had been scuffed for years, and I had always thought I'd wait for someone else to do it. But now I had the time, the quiet, and the autonomy. I wrote, buy brush, choose color. I added, send thank you cards to the guests from Christmas. They had brought something into my life I hadn't realized I needed. Strangers who treated the house with care, who treated me with respect, not because they were family, but because they chose to. Then I wrote, host spring weekend, underlined twice. The idea of inviting people again, different people, maybe an old friend from Raleigh or one of the women from the library group, made my chest feel lighter. Later that day, I made a slow lunch, roasted carrots, lentil soup, a slice of sourdough from the freezer that I toasted and buttered. I ate at the kitchen table with a cloth napkin in my lap, the afternoon light shifting across the floor in gold and blue patterns. I didn't rush. I didn't check my phone. I didn't think about who might walk in or what noise might rise from another room. I thought only about what I might do next. A new recipe, a visit to the community center. I had circled a Tai Chi class on their bulletin board 2 weeks ago, and I found myself thinking about it again as I cleared the dishes. I didn't know if I'd enjoy it, but I liked the thought of being among people who moved slowly on purpose. That evening, I lit a fire in the fireplace and read in the armchair until dusk turned to dark. I didn't turn on the overhead light, just the lamp beside me, the one I had missed. And when I finally made my way back upstairs, I walked into the front room, turned down the bed, and slid beneath the quilt with a sigh that felt deeper than sleep. The walls were quiet. The house was still. My name was once again written into every corner. I belonged here, not as a favor, not as a memory, as the woman who owned the front room, and the woman who still had plans.